Welcome to Think Like Fire. This is a presentation I've been giving actually for the last couple of years to small groups at one of the major nurseries around. Because I think that we all need to realize, as Julie recognized, climate change is really truly happening. Our fire seasons are stretching out much farther than they ever have before. We even had a little scare here in Oregon just a week ago where we had dry, warmer than usual temperature weather and a lot of east dry wind. And so there was a red flag warning for a lot of the areas of Oregon. So living in an urban environment, I think we all need to realize that it's not necessarily protection against wildfire, as Santa Rosa, California, and Talent, Oregon residents learned all too well and too painfully recently. To design a landscape which is fire resistant, not fireproof, you must first think like fire. And so rather than delving into plant lists, I'm more in tune with giving you more information about how fire acts, the conditions that fuel it, and the strategies of how to manage it in a landscape. So what is firescaping? Firescaping is a new term, relatively new term, that born out of the ashes of wildfires we've experienced over the last 2 years. And my definition of that is designing, planting, and maintaining a landscape to resist wildfire, because everything will ultimately burn. So why do we talk about defensible landscapes in an urban environment? Well, we all remember the Eagle Creek fire. That was a huge, terrible disaster several years back. But this is the Santa Rosa fire. And this was a suburb with fire hydrants on the corners, and it burned to the ground. And so did Paradise, California, and our own overlook neighborhood here in Portland, which is over by Portland University of Portland. And they discovered that living in urban environments can put you at risk too, even if there's a fire hydrant down the street. This is a map of last year's wildfires here in Oregon. So we all remember the Beachy Creek fire that threatened Salem, and the Riverside fire in Clackamas, and the Lamb's Head fire in Jefferson County, and the South Opechen fire, which impacted not only Ashland, but Talent and Phoenix also, and took out 2,800 structures. Talent, Oregon, not much left. There were nearly a dozen fires in all in the state of Oregon, and even more in Washington. In Oregon, statewide, 7 people died, and 1 million acres burned. So if a property is at the edge of a wild land, and a wild land is something like Oaks Bottom or Johnson Creek or Sullivan's Gulch, or near a wild urban park like Forest Park that you're looking at right here, or Mount Tabor or Rocky or Powell Butte, properties could be impacted by fire as easily as in a rural area. These areas are also called wildland urban interface. Basically, it's a term that planners and fire professionals have started to use. And this is a good example of a wildland urban interface and what's left after a wildfire goes through. Portland, the Portland Fire Department developed, is so in tune with this that several years back, they developed this hazard map, which shows you, I think you can see my cursor. At the top of the map is the Columbia River. Bisecting the map is the Willamette River. All of the areas in brown are wildlands. So what you see here is Forest Park. This is out by the Wapato Jail. This is Rocky Butte. This is Powell Butte. And then all the darker blue areas are neighborhoods that are occupied either densely or even modestly densely, and are at risk. And this was determined by the Portland Fire Department. So there's some awareness that these are risky lands. Wildfires are dependent upon three things: fuel, terrain, and weather. Fuel equals combustible materials like wood siding and cedar shakes and composition roofs, or dead or dry plants, and thick understories. Terrain that drives fires is basically steep hillsides, ravines, any place that's difficult to reach, and deeply forested areas or wild grasslands. And weather, the kind of weather that determines wildfires is basically low humidity, high temperatures, and wind. That creates the perfect storm. So in order to really design landscapes to resist fire, you have to first think like fire. So here are some basic facts. A wildfire which burns fast is hottest and hardest to control. A fire which burns vertically is very fast moving. And the goal there is to keep the fire low and slow moving so there's time to control it. Here's a shot of a driveway with a house at the top, and you can see how very heavily treed the lot is. This is a piece of property that I can talk about because I lived there. We bought the place several years back, didn't stay very long, and it was only less than 3.5 miles from downtown Portland. But this property sat in heavy forest, as you can see. But what you can't see is that it's hung off the side of a ravine in Portland. And had I realized what I realize now, this would not have been a favored piece of property. Because if there was a fire that would have started at the bottom of the ravine, not only would it race up the ravine, but it would be very difficult to escape it. And very difficult to treat it because it's in a ravine. So topography makes a difference. And if a property sits at the top of a hill or a bluff or a ravine, as my house did, as most view properties do, although I didn't have a view just at the forest, but still, it is at risk when a fire starts at the bottom of a slope because the fire will race up the vertical surface. The one thing that's very important to understand too is you're planning a defensible landscape is to understand the direction of prevailing winds with that piece of property, especially in the summer and the early fall. That's during fire season, right? And in Portland, the summer winds are out of the northwest, and in the fall, they're driven from the east, typically. So if a property is at the edge of a wildland urban interface, downwind, and at the top of a slope, the property is seriously at risk. So here are some landscape design considerations. If you've got a property like this, Using hardscape near the house and structures to create fire breaks is not only a strategic, but a functional way of dealing with the landscape. Paths of gravel, river rock, concrete, driveways, patios, whatever you have, think of that as a fire break, because that is what it is, or could become. When you're designing pools or ponds or water features into landscapes, they too can be used as some emergency water if you've got a fire, only if they can be pumped to where the water is needed. So it's not just about placing a pond, but it's also about figuring out how to get the water out of it. One of the great strategies is to design a meadow around a house, 20 to 50 feet deep, and keep it irrigated. And in the hottest part of the summer, when things just dry out because they dry out, mow it. So that what you're doing is you're creating as low and wide an area of very little vegetation, lightweight vegetation as you can create. And avoid using combustible mulch. I know around the house is the worst place for this kind of thing when you're in a fire risky environment. Wood chips and sawdust and leaf mulch are simply tinder for fires, and they can smolder for a long time and then erupt. So you might think you're safe, but you're not. So instead of considering combustible mulches, think about using river rock or gravel as mulch, which is non-combustible, protects a foundation, keeps a foundation dry, and keeps the weeds down as well. When you're in the middle of planning a large piece of property, think about placing multiple hose bibs around the property for quick hookups. Even when the distribution is even the distribution of water and that's a good strategy, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to irrigate the entire property, but in an emergency, those areas, the outside areas, perimeter areas, can be wet down. So this is a property that was designed by a friend of mine who is a landscape architect for herself and her husband. It's on the gorge, very windy, obviously a view site, so at the top of a hill. And she actually employed most of the strategies that I just talked about. Gravel paths that are wide, low plantings near the house, non-combustible materials near the house. She designed several seating areas, and I'll show you those, that are concrete. They're either concrete pavers or they're concrete flat work. And you can see in the background, beyond the outdoor dining table, there's this wonderful meadow that they keep mowed with a little lawn. If you look really hard between the past this grouping of plant material, looks like there's a tiny little lawn that is irrigated. So she's done pretty well. Here's another shot of the same area from another view. You can see that how low the plantings are along the house, close to the house, with major trees in the background, probably at least 25 feet away, it looks like. And she has used gravel mulch close to the house and in those particular beds. The property has a pool on it, and they've made sure that they can pump the water out of it by having a generator close by, as well as a pump. And this is, it was like an afterthought, but I think that because of where they're located and how far they are away from a fire hydrant, that it's probably a really good strategy for them. Here's another couple of shots of two other seating areas. Great views, which also means you're at the top of a hill. The fire pit is very open and very low plantings around it. And a meadow between that and the big trees that are in the background. And the other, on the right side of the screen, is another little sitting area that basically has boulders and low plantings around it that are pretty insignificant, but give some softness to the landscape. So you can see that your plant palette isn't necessarily restricted. You just have to be really creative about how you use it. So this is a slide of a couple of references that you should be aware of. One is fire-resistant landscape plants specific to the Willamette Valley, created by OSU. And it is a really great resource, easy to use, well organized. And the other is a listing of plants that are very common and very flammable. So rather than giving you lists, I'm going to direct you to these two resources, and you don't have to write these down immediately. Put your pens down, because I'm going to post it at the very end while we're in the middle of a little bit of question and answer periods. So let's talk a little bit about the criteria for low risk and high risk plantings. What you're seeing right now is a shot of my friend's, a little vignette of my friend's garden with some low risk plantings in it. And a low risk plant is really determined by a few things. One is high moisture content in the leaves and broad and thick leaves. An open growth habit. A plant that's well maintained, so no dead plant material. A high risk plant, on the other hand, is a plant that's got a lot of high oil or high resin content in the leaf or the bark. A plant that has a very dense structure to it, low leaf moisture content, low moisture content in the leaves, and the presence of dead material, so something that's not well maintained. And occasionally peeling bark. And the reason that it's peeling bark is on that list is because if the bark catches fire and it's peely, it's easily taken away by the wind. So you want to cut that down as much as you can. Generally, deciduous trees and plants are less flammable than conifers. And think about that. You know, a Douglas fir needle, when you break it, does have an aromatic quality to it. And so, but let's see, a big broad fat leaf, arbutus, does not. So those are the guidelines for choosing plants that may be less risky or more risky than others, as well as you'll have the lists that I'm going to give you at the end of the talk. So a few photographs of highly flammable plants. Ivy, very flammable, commonly used, unfortunately. Juniper of any kind, highly flammable because of its aromatic qualities. Honeysuckle, I was really surprised to find this on the list, but I double checked and it's on several lists. So honeysuckle is one of those flammable plants. Eucalyptus. Now, eucalyptus, given the criteria that I just mentioned, eucalyptus is one of those plants that you'd break off a leaf and think, oh, I need to think about that one. And Scotch broom. Now, granted, nobody in their right mind who is a good designer would even think about putting Scotch broom in somebody's yard, but there are yards that have Scotch broom adjacent to them. And so I included it because it really is highly flammable. And it's all found along our roadsides and wildlands all over the state. So some other plants that I don't have images of, but fall into this category are cypress. Some of the cypress, definitely Doug fir, arborvitae, rosemary, lavender, bamboo, because bamboo's leaves are so papery and dry, and tall grasses like maiden grass if they're not cut back when they dry out in the dry season. There are some planting strategies too that go along with fire escaping, like spacing the larger plants, which would be trees and shrubs, large shrubs, so far apart that the fire cannot jump easily from canopy to canopy. So farther apart than you might think. The spacing is really dependent, of course, on the mature plant and the growth habit of the plant. And nature is a good gauge to take cues from if they're natural plantings. Large trees should be planted 50 feet or more from houses and garages and other structures. Smaller plants can be closer to structures, but again, pay attention to which small plants you're planting and how you mulch. And avoid planting continuous rows of susceptible plants. You know, we all love to plant in sweeps of things. So sweeps of lavender or hedge rows of juniper, not so much of a good idea when you're in a fire risk situation. Leave some space between your shrubs and the perennial groupings to reduce the fire's ability to spread. Fire professionals call this kind of spreading firebrands. And what it basically is, it's flying embers that are ignited off of trees or plants and are caught by the wind and get carried feet, many feet. And so they're a high risk kind of situation. And if you space your plantings a little farther apart, that helps that situation. So the second critical strategy, along with what you plant and how you plant, is maintenance. And we're not always in control of maintenance, but we can coach our clients on why it's so critical to maintain a fire escape. Like limbing up conifers, you know, get those limbs off the ground 10 to 15 feet. And if it's a larger tree, sometimes you must go 20 feet above grade. Low-hanging branches and tall shrubs and dry grasses are just create fuel ladders. So the whole point is to eliminate that. Trim up branches away from roofs and decks. Even if the deck is a composite material, it'll still catch fire. So keep them away from that. And urge your clients to keep their gutters and their roofs free of debris and needles. Get them to mow meadows in the dry months. And well-watered landscapes are, of course, the most fire-resistant landscapes. They, if you design with a lawn and design it into a landscape, you need to urge your client to keep it watered and mowed, even in the dry months, just for their own protection. Removing invasives is important, like Himalayan blackberry, ivy, and Scotch broom. All of these plants create really dense thickets, and they provide fast food for a fire, you know, just like a McDonald's or a Taco Bell drive-through. So counsel your client to do the basic ongoing maintenance, like removing dead or dying trees, fallen limbs after a storm, blackberry thickets, and that will help to save their own landscape. With large properties, there are fire sprinklers that can be designed into the landscape as part of an irrigation system that sits at the perimeter of the property and allows an owner to quickly drench the perimeter when it's needed. And some of these systems are smart enough now that they can be operated remotely from your phone. So if it's a vacation home that you're working on, it can be protected even when it's vacant, which I'm sure doesn't keep, it would keep me up at night if I didn't have a stop, some type of a strategy like that. So the last thing that I would like you to encourage your clients to be is one with their neighbors. A property is only as defensible as the neighbor's property next door. Encourage neighbors to follow the same protocol as your clients so that one neighbor doesn't put all at risk. And get your clients to share the load to help maintain everyone's properties. It's much more fun having a pruning party like this that you're looking at than it is to prune by yourself alone on a hot summer's day. So make it fun. Even as designers, we're responsible to remind our clients that no one is an island, especially in a wildfire. We all need each other's help. So at this point, I'm going to invite questions. And I'm going to give you the very last slide so that you can see the 2 links that I provided for the lists.